Hey, it's Shannon,
Hey, it's Paulina.
and welcome to Pop for Thought. Welcome to our
Hello.
podcast.
Welcome back. Another week.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Revisiting the mid 2000s. It's a good time for me.
Yeah. Honestly, well, the 2010s, I guess, eh?
Right. 2012, the show Girls came out. And that's what we're talking about today.
I'm surprised the show went on as long as it did.
I always forget that it was 6 seasons.
That's a lot of seasons, and that it ended only 5 years ago. To me, it feels like it's like a 10-year ago show.
Yeah, well, it premiered. So we're coming up right on the 10-year anniversary of Girls. So this is the perfect time to discuss and revisit. But it premiered 10 years ago. But yeah, it didn't finish that long ago, which is why while I was watching it, I was like, this both feels like it was forever ago and also just happened.
I think also not as many people were watching the show. It wasn't as big as it was in the sixth season as it was when it got all the attention when it came out during the first season.
For sure. Yeah. It did. I think its popularity did taper off a little bit. Were you a fan of the show Girls? Did you watch it? Yeah.
I was. I actually remember the moment that I was introduced to it, and it was when Lena Dunham won her Golden Globe for it. She won for Best Television Series Musical Comedy, and then she also won for Best Actress Musical or Comedy, and I thought she was very unique, and I loved her speech, and I was like, what is this? And then that night I started watching the show, and I loved it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But what about you? Were you a fan?
I was the exact demographic, if you will.
Yeah.
I was 23 when it aired. I think the characters were about 24, 25 when in the show when it started. So I could relate to them in an age sense. I was 23. I'm a white girl millennial.
Right.
So, this show is really about white girl millennials.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there was a lot of it that I was very much eating up at the time. And I got really into it. I thought it was really funny and really different. And yeah. I mean, I also think that over time, my interest sort of waned in the show, but I still ended up watching it to the very end. I would describe Girls as a show that people love to hate watch.
True.
Myself included.
Yeah, absolutely. For anyone that hasn't seen the show Girls, do you want to give a quick overview of kind of what the show is?
Let's get into it. So the overall premise of the show Girls is it follows the lives of 4 mid-20s white girls in Brooklyn. Hannah Horvath, Marnie Michaels, Shoshana Shapiro, and Jessa Johansson. Love those name alliterations, by the way. It follows these 4 women in particular as they navigate love, sex, money, friendship through the course of 6 seasons. Hannah is the main character. She is the main focus of the show. She's an aspiring writer. And when we meet her, she is 24 and her parents have just cut her off financially. And she famously declares in the pilot, I think I may be the voice of my generation or the voice of a generation. Mm-hmm. So that's where we begin. And that really kind of sets the tone for the season and for the show in general. Yeah, and I think that's kind of a question we want to maybe ask today, right? Is looking back on Girls or revisiting Girls, was it the voice of a generation? So we'll get into that.
I think that's an important question to ask too, because I do remember when it did come out, I did think of the show as something that was very refreshing and something very real. And like you said, being in the demo, it was very relatable. So you and I were huge fans of the show Sex and the City, but I watched that kind of with a different lens because I didn't totally understand everything that was going on in the world. And I understood that had happened in the past and I was just jumping on board. But this kind of felt like a millennial version of Sex and the City, where I was like, oh, this is like a fresh take. And these girls aren't like super rich and have all these designer clothes, but they're also just like struggling, trying to make their way in the world, similar to also where I was at that point in time. So that's what I really thought of it at the time. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is like, and it's HBO. So it had all the nudity and it just felt so real. So that's at the time I was like, this is revolutionary. But now looking back and rewatching this past week, I think, I don't know.
So Sex and the City obviously was a big influence and a big inspiration.
Mm.
And it's meant to be. And they actually even do a little shout out to Sex in the City in the pilot of Girls. And there's a poster, a Sex in the City poster in Shoshana's room, and they have a little discussion about are you a Carrie or Samantha or whatever. So it was meant to inspire the series. But like you were saying, Sex in the City, and this is what Lena Dunham was saying, Sex in the City focuses on these already very successful women. And then at the time, there was also Gossip Girl that was in existence, and that was focusing on high school and their experience in New York and navigating those things that we were talking about. And there wasn't really that age in the middle that she wanted to speak to. So it certainly was a very interesting perspective, or we got to get a perspective that was very much speaking to us.
I think I didn't realize as much, or I remember that Judd Apatow was a producer of the show, but I didn't realize that he was as involved in this show as he was. This was like he's the executive producer of the show.
That it's going to be funny, right? And yeah. This show is funny.
The writing,
rewatching it, I was like, okay, this is hilarious. Lena Dunham served as head writer for the show, and then executively produced by Judd Apatow. So we hadn't really heard of Lena Dunham prior to this. Like, she was really brought into our sphere of awareness through this series. Yeah. And this series also was, based on film that she had done, Tiny Furniture. And I think it has Jemima Kirk in there as well. Judd Apatow saw that and thought it was really well done, and so they agreed to work together, and then they created Girls. So let's talk about, we already talked a little bit about how it won some awards. Obviously, again, the only season it won awards was season 1.
There were some controversies that came out about Lena Dunham later on in the later seasons, and that is seen as a reason as to why it didn't receive any nominations. But it was nominated, I believe, in the early seasons, and then by the end it wasn't.
Some nominations for sure, some wins in the first season. Generally, critical response, very positive for the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because a big point that was made when the show first came out was the amount of nudity that was in the show. And a lot of that was due to Lena Dunham just being naked. There were some critiques about it as well, because she doesn't have the conventional body type that we're used to seeing when we do see nudity on TV. So a lot of people praised her for that, because they saw that as something that was refreshing and new and wonderful, especially because a lot of the times when she was nude on screen, it wasn't always in like a sexual manner. And the reason that she said that she did a lot of nudity is just because she wanted the show to be a representation of real life. So if you're in your apartment doing something, you might not have a shirt on all the time or something like that. So that's just why she wanted to include that in there. But I remember watching that too and being like, well, it's like nice to see a regular body on TV.
It was refreshing, right? And there was a lot of criticism around it. And it's like, well, what are you criticizing exactly?
Yeah. And if she looked a different way, would you not be criticizing?
If Marnie was the main character and she was getting as naked, and actually Marnie has more sex scenes, someone was saying, than Hannah's character. Really? Nobody's complaining about that. Nobody's upset. So I think when there was some pushback on that, I was like, okay. But I think, people thought it was actually really cringy because of how real and honest in a way it was, right. Like the way it was portraying these millennial women. And as a viewer, I often was like so uncomfortable and cringing at a lot of the things that they were saying or doing. But part of that was because I found it a little bit relatable. I was like, oh, that is actually how we are sometimes. Yeah. And it's like, I hate myself, but I can see myself.
Totally.
That is sort of one part of the brilliance of Girls, I think, is that it makes you sort of see these things that you really don't like about yourself or your particular age demographic, and all the things that people are criticizing about millennials. You're like, it's right there in front of you.
Show. Yeah,
it's in the show, and you're like, oh boy, that really is. It is like that.
Totally. And I thought that was really interesting about the show as well, because when you're watching it, you don't exactly fall in love with all of these characters. They don't have all of these redeeming qualities that you see in, for example, again, Sex in the City, where you're like, oh, I like this person for this reason or this for that, like, or the show Friends, for example, where they have these like quirky personality traits. But girls, you kind of go through the list of their traits and you think like, okay, she's annoying for this reason, she's annoying for that reason, she's entitled for this reason. So you kind of just watch the show because it's entertaining, but you're not necessarily falling in love with these characters like you would think that you
Oh,
would.
not at all are we falling in love with these characters. I actually hate all of them. Like
I hate all of them too.
there's nobody likable on the show.
No,
That's not true. There's some supporting characters that are likable on the show. But
right.
the four main girls, like, really, are you rooting for any of them? And that's the thing. So what I think a big reason why we wanted to discuss Girls today was we both watched the show when it came out, and we felt like in a way that it spoke to us, sure, and it was funny and different and all of that. As time went on, there's some controversies and criticisms about the show, which we'll talk about, but as time went on, I kind of would look back on Girls and be like, that was a really annoying show. Why did, like, I don't even know, like, was that even a good show at all?
Right.
Or am I like, were we just absorbed in it at the time, but it probably hasn't aged well? Like, we don't like any of the characters. But then rewatching it and revisiting it now, I'm like, I don't think we were supposed to like the characters.
Exactly.
I think that these are supposed to be awful people, and they're supposed to be, the show is really a satire of millennial white millennials, right?
Yeah.
It's really a satire. They're these very exaggerated, obnoxious, narcissistic monsters. And you couldn't, of course you're not supposed to like, if you do like them, I mean, I don't know what if you're watching the show and you see Marnie and you're like, oh my God, I love Marnie, I'm such a Marnie, I am worried about you.
Exactly.
I am concerned.
I feel that way with any of them. And I think too, I felt that same way going back and rewatching it. I think I didn't realize as much at the time how self-aware they were doing these characters, where we're critiquing them for being obnoxious, but they're writing the characters to be obnoxious. That they know what they're doing and they put them in this situation, and they are highlighting this specific type of mid-20s millennial girls who maybe are relying a little too much on their parents for money and not taking their jobs seriously and quitting their jobs at the first chance that they get when they first don't like something, and they have this sense of entitlement around them.
This entitlement, and you see so much in the show and these characters. Even the supporting characters, like Desi is a good example. Marnie's like husband for a brief period of time. All of these characters, they just really feel as though they are so important. They have this inflated sense of self and what they should be doing. Like, they all do really think they're special. And that's been a criticism and a critique of millennial culture forever, right? And so it really actually was a super smart and funny way to make fun of that group of people.
Rewatching it, there's a few like bottle episodes that I really forgot how much I liked.
Bottle episodes are a strong
definitely
point in this show.
There was one where they went to the Hamptons and they were trying to rebond as a group because they'd all kind of fallen out, and Shoshana all of a sudden breaks and just calls them all out and like calls Hannah a narcissist, and Hannah goes, that's not even a complete, people have been calling me a narcissist since I was 3. She's like very self-aware in the fact that like, yeah, she's a narcissist and she's aware of that. So like, do better, like give me something else. So I think that's just one example of the self-awareness that these characters, it's like, they know that they're flawed and they know that, but they're not necessarily willing to change those things.
Well, they're self-aware in some ways. And then there's other ways where they are just so wildly
like unaware,
oblivious to their talents, like, or the reach of their talents, or, that inflated sense of self that I was talking about. Like, there's like Marnie and Desi, for example, are having a conversation about, she's like, oh, they're musicians. They basically, Marnie and Desi come in at one point and they're basically contestants on The Voice, right. Or that's sort of the brand that I get from them. And they are shitty musicians at the end of the day, but they're like, oh, it's not like I know that Fleetwood Mac went through some stuff and so can we, and not that we're Fleetwood Mac, and Desi's like, you should feel like we are Fleetwood Mac. Like they just, it's just, there's so many things that they say that they make these comparisons that just are so inaccurate and not at all grounded in reality. So there's also that side of it too, which is really okay. So the Sex and the City thing, just because this show is clearly inspired by it,
four white women in New York City in their mid-20s,
it's impossible not to draw those comparisons, right? But they were inspired by that for sure. And I think though the difference is Sex and the City was not, it was not meant to make fun of those particular women. You were meant to form an attachment to those characters, and the characters were meant to be likable, and they were. There's a reason that we are so invested in those characters still to this day. That is not the case for girls. You're not really rooting for any of them. They're not particularly likable. And I would also say that Sex and the City is very different in that it is actually at the end of the day about friendship and the friendship between these women, where I would say that Girls at the end of the day was actually just about Hannah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially because at the end of the show, they don't resolve as friends and they're not all happy. It doesn't end on like that happy note.
Well, they've all actually grown apart.
Yeah, which is realistic.
I think Shoshana's character was always too good for that group.
Yeah.
In some sense, she just had a little bit more, she had a bit of a better head on her shoulders in some sense, and they were all just kind of floating around and didn't know what the hell they were doing and living in their own bubbles. But so she, at the end of the series, basically says, I think we should just call it. And she's really saying what I think we all were thinking, because it's like these women, unlike the women in Sex and City or the Friendships and Friends or like any of these shows that came before them about these New York friendships, unlike those ones, these girls they made each other miserable throughout the entire series. Things we liked about the show.
The writing.
Some of the things we've talked about, just how it has that voice.
Yeah, it was relatable.
That cringy realness, that cringy relatability. Yes.
I think if you were to look back at this show and wanted to see like in decades down the line, and you want to see what life was like in the 2010s, this show is a perfect example of that.
Yes, that is what I love about rewatching a series, is that time capsule aspect. And honestly, rewatching this, there were so many things, just like the style.
I know, the clothes.
Even just their style and the clothes. And again, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it was. But I just was like, oh my God, I remember like living in that kind of world.
Yeah.
And the music.
And the iPhone 4s and the, yeah.
Well, okay, can we all, sorry, but Marnie is texting on a fucking BlackBerry in season 1.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no wonder she's such a bitch. Like I'm sorry, but just a BlackBerries were long gone by then.
Were they by 2010?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Everyone was switching over to the iPhones. Even like the sounds that the phones were making when they would ring and stuff like that. I was like, wow, this is bringing me back. Or like the chevron shirts that like Hannah would be wearing, or the long necklaces, just so
oh my God, there's like the feathers in the hair. And I was like, no, the feathers.
Oh, I had that. I had a feather extension.
So did I. Who among us? Embarrassing, super embarrassing. But like that episode where they're partying at the club, but Iconopop comes on, and I'm like, Iconopop was the party song of an entire year. And I just was like, oh my God, like this like really takes me back to just being young and having fun at house parties or at the bar.
Yeah. Is that the episode where Hannah is high and then trades shirts with a guy, but she's not wearing a bra and it's like a mesh tank top, so you just see her boobs the entire episode?
So that leads me to what I think is the best part about Girls. And that's Elijah. Elijah, played by Andrew Rannells. This role, scene stealer 100%. I honestly, Elijah is the best part of the show. Nobody
Yeah,
is funnier than Elijah in the show, I don't
and
think.
he becomes as almost as much of a main character near the end of the
He
show as
does.
the girls do.
For sure. It started as a minor character, but because I think he was just so good, his delivery on every line, his delivery was just incredible. And the comedic timing, I love him. Another underrated, he might be appropriately rated. I think people generally agree that he's great, but underrated character, Rita Wilson
Oh,
as
yes.
Marnie's mom.
Yes.
Oh my God. Like, we have met this mom, right? We have all met this mom.
She is the perfect and such a good person to play Marnie's mom. Like, their dynamic is insane.
I know.
I'm like, you guys could be family in real life. It's amazing. There was one scene that was so random that I watched the other day where Adam Driver's character comes in and he goes, "Look what I found." And she goes, "Is that a framed photo of Tom Hanks?" And he goes, "Yeah." And then he like puts it up as they're talking. So it just like doesn't have anything to add to the show. But I wondered if they had maybe put that in there since Rita Wilson is Tom Hanks's wife.
They had to. I feel like that was intentional for sure. But what I always remember is like her phone case with the what are these things called? I'm just gesturing to Shannon, so in case
it's like a brass
brass knuckles.
Okay, yeah, brass knuckles.
So she has a brass knuckles phone case, and I'm just like, why? But it makes perfect sense for her character. I just feel like her brilliance and her comedic brilliance in that role is so underrated. It's so good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something else that I want to bring up about how good the show was just the great amount of guest stars that would be in the show. We have everybody from Donald Glover, Jenny Slate, Gabby Hoffman. Who else?
Gabby Hoffman as the brutally bizarre, which also amazing performance, honestly.
And to be siblings with Adam Driver, that dynamic too. I'm like, you two could be siblings in real life too. That was amazing. Patrick Wilson, Riz Ahmed, Amy Schumer pops up, Adie Bryant. Like, it just keeps
Natasha Lyonne in a very memorable scene for the one word alone, unconscionable. Like, she just repeats unconscionable like several times. And that is like anytime I saw, as soon as she appeared on screen, when I was watching this episode again recently, I was like, oh, unconscionable, here we come.
Amazing.
Gillian Jacobs, who plays, another. Is it
Gillian or Jillian?
It's Gillian.
Oh, I thought it was like spelled like it's like GIF versus GIF. I thought it was like that. But I guess
it's open to interpretation, just like GIF and GIF.
Exactly. Tomato.
It's Gillian Jacobs.
She's great too.
As yet another insufferable artist character, Mimi Rose Howard.
Yeah, and she's good at playing insufferable roles.
She was so good. And that story arc I thought was so great too. It was just like when Hannah comes home from her Iowa writers workshop and finds another woman living in her apartment as Adam's new girlfriend, just like head explode. Like, the show really did have a great way. This is one of the great things about the show too. It really had a great way of just making you feel shock and horror, like in your stomach when like something happened, like whether it was Mimi Rose Howard and, living in Hannah's apartment and nobody told her. There was just so many moments in the show where there would be like this bomb kind of dropped on somebody. Right. And I actually thought they did a really good job of like keeping that dramatic element going. Or like Hannah finding out about Jessa and Adam. You're like, oh my God, I like feel sick for this. Like, that is so, again, just a very real and raw way of presenting some of those emotions.
Something that you will notice is right when watching the show, first episode, is that this show is very white. And we've seen that in shows in the past, again, to bring up Friends and Seinfeld and Sex and the City. But we kind of credited that to the show being in the past. But for a show to come out in 2010 and to have four main characters that are all white, that obviously brought along some criticism. And I
And
remember
again,
being
why
shocked
wouldn't you
too.
learn? Did you not learn from like the criticisms of Sex and the City? Like that was so, everyone was making a big deal out of that, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
shouldn't you know
Right.
by that
So
point? Yeah.
Lena Dunham's defense in this, and I'll insert a clip of her talking about it to give it in her own words.
As for the race criticisms on the show, I totally heard those, and I was really happy that it opened up a dialogue about race on television, which is one we need to be having and need to continue having. And I tried to, respond to it sensitively, and I heard people and they said, like, that doesn't reflect my New York. And as the show expanded, I tried to expand its world culturally. And I also I hope it started a conversation about the fact that what we need is more showrunners of color who are telling their own stories.
And then she said she also is just like writing from who she is as a person for these other characters, but then also just bring in other people into the writer's room that write from different experiences to have different experiences portrayed on screen. Like it's just everything that she kind of said, I thought, well, you could have just done better.
And because she said she wanted to avoid any tokenism or whatever. And like, I get all that. And I get why she's like, doesn't feel like she could write that character, but like bring in somebody who can.
And make it not an example of tokenism. Like just bring in more people of color. Then I feel like tokenism is like when you bring in that one person just to like fill that so that you don't get that criticism, but then you can just take it further than that to make it not a tokenism example.
But then I guess it would be a show about insufferable white people.
Yeah,
if it was
I guess
more diversified, and maybe that was the point, was it for it to be a show about insufferable white people. So
yeah, but I think like if you had made Adam Driver's character, for example, not white, that could have really just highlighted even more how white they were. He could have like maybe called them out on it more, or more of those comparisons could have been made in that dynamic. So by season 2, you can see that they had listened to some of those critiques. So they brought Donald Glover in for about 2 episodes and then he was gone.
I did think that the Donald Glover inclusion, they were deliberately addressing that criticism with his inclusion, and the way she did treat that character, and how she was talking about, she's like, I don't actually see, like they were deliberate in those episodes, in how she was like treating him and her reactions and her commentary on it. Right. And she was saying like, I actually don't see color, or she said that she has never heard of Missy Elliott, which was it was a really funny scene. He's like, he was like, that was a Missy Elliott lyric. And she's like, well, I don't even know who that is. Like they were but see, that's what I liked about that's what I like, because if you're looking at it, it's like they're making this commentary on it, and they bring in a Black character to highlight how ridiculous and fool and oblivious these characters are, right? So I thought that was a great inclusion, but again, like he was there for 2 episodes, and then we didn't really see anyone went back to how it was.
Right. So another criticism that is brought up around this show, especially looking back now, that people are pointing out, is that the 4 main girls are also all examples of nepotism. These are all women who have had successful parents in the industry that have maybe contributed to them landing these jobs. Lena's mom, Lori Simmons, she's an artist and a photographer. Her dad is a famous painter, and their family are also cousins of the Tiffany family, who, as we know, are prominent in the jewelry trade. So that's something there. Lena has responded to this as well. But before we get into that, Zosha Mamet, who played Shoshana, she's a daughter of a playwright, screenwriter, and a director. Allison Williams, as we know, is the daughter of Brian Williams, the former NBC News anchor. And Jemima Kirk grew up with Lena. So they were really close growing up. And her dad's a former drummer of a rock band. So they all kind of grew up in this situation. Also, like Lena's mom, like babysat Claire Danes growing up. So they were like, they had connections.
They had connections in the industry.
Right. But Lena is saying that they were of a certain class, but they didn't have connections that would have gotten her this job.
And the nepotism thing is ridiculous. It's like no one ever got a television show because their mother was like, an alternative art figure in the 1980s and 90s. Like, that's not how it works. I wish that's how it worked. And I didn't cast anyone for any reason but that they are people who fascinate and thrill me. And
Brian Williams didn't strong-arm you into...
No, I didn't grow up in a house that watched news. I didn't even really know who Brian Williams was. I was like, had him confused with Charlie Rose. I was like, okay, guys, do your thing. I thought Zosh's name was Zosiah Mamay. I didn't even realize. And I'm not, I respect David Mamet's work thoroughly, but I wasn't like, gotta get a Mamet in this show. Jemima's my best friend from, 6th grade.
I can definitely see the Allison Williams one, right?
Yeah.
Because she was a very unknown person.
Right. But Lena also said, saying like, I didn't even watch the news. I didn't know who that was and stuff like that. I'm like, okay.
I've never even heard of Missy Elliott.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Allison Williams, in her defense, I suppose, she got that role, obviously, I think, because of her connections, I think. So, but she plays a really good Marnie.
Yeah, too well.
So I think her performance is quite good. Yeah, she's the worst in it. So, yeah. And I don't think that maybe she's the worst in real life.
No.
Otherwise, yeah.
Those are some of the main controversies around the show.
Let's get into Lena.
Okay. So Lena Dunham, when the show came out, because she was kind of had this reputation of being this strong feminist woman who was very comfortable with her sexuality and body and all of these things, her character in the show is very much intertwined with who she is as a person. So we kind of all see her as kind of just the same. And because of this, I think all these controversies that started to come out about her, these comments that she was making, really went against this reputation that we have, or this image that we have of Lena Dunham, which I think just almost makes all of this stuff worse. But there's some pretty bad stuff. I knew some of them, but then really diving in, I was like, Lena, what are you doing? The big one that really made me lose a lot of respect for Lena Dunham is when one of the writers on the show Girls, whose name is Murray Miller, was accused of sexual assault. He was accused of sexual assault from an actress, Aurora Perrineau. And she said that when she was just 17 years old, she was raped by this writer, Murray Miller.
Oh, wow. So
this was during the Me Too movement, when this all started. And Lena and Jenny Koner, who's a co-showrunner and writer of Girls, they released a statement about this sexual assault, defending Murray and saying that this actress, Aurora, is a liar. So I want to read this statement that they wrote because it's insane to reread. During the windfall of deeply necessary accusations over the last few months in Hollywood, we have been thrilled to see so many women's voices heard and dark experiences in this industry justified. It's a hugely important time of change, and like every feminist in Hollywood and beyond, we celebrate. But during every time of change, there's also instances of the culture and an enthusiasm and zeal taking down the wrong targets. We believe, having worked closely with him for more than half a decade, that in this case with Murray Miller, that this is the case with Murray Miller. While our first instinct is to listen to every woman's story, our insider knowledge of Murray's situation makes us confident that sadly, this accusation is one of the 3% of assault cases that are misreported every year. It's a true shame to add to that number, as outside of Hollywood women still struggle to be believed. We stand by Murray, and this is all we'll be saying about this issue. Which, what? No, the first rule of the Me Too movement and women supporting women is that you believe women, because majority of the time they don't have a reason to, there's nothing that they benefit from with coming out with something like this, you know? And it also doesn't help that this is a Black woman that is making these accusations, and then Lena is just discrediting them. So no, this is so bad.
Yeah, I mean, it very much comes off as, we believe that we should always believe women, but in this case, we know this person, so we're not going to.
And that's the dumbest excuse too, when people say, like, when somebody gets accused of something and they go, well, I've known them for years and they've never done anything around me. Like, yeah, no shit. They're probably have done anything around the majority of people. That's not a good reason. That just made my blood boil. And what's worse about all of this is that Lena then I like after all of this happened, she regretted making the statement. So she doubled down and apologized and actually admitted that they didn't actually have any insider information. She made that part up.
What didn't sit well with me, especially in that, is this like statistic that she threw out there. I don't know. It's something about that just seemed very cold in terms of her response to that person's accusation. Like maybe if this was a friend of hers that's being accused, she can maybe believe him and not this person that's made. But the like, you know what? I think this actually falls into the 3% statistic of, women who falsely accuse. Like, that to me just didn't sit right in that defense.
Yeah. So in this essay where she apologized, she said, "I didn't have the insider information I claimed, but rather blind faith in a story that kept slipping and changing and revealed itself to me nothing at all. I wanted to feel my workplace and my world were safe, untouched by the outside world," which is just delusional. So then Lena comes out with a book, which I remember buying and loving and thinking like, I love Lena. I was such a fan of her. So Lena made a few references in her book, telling stories about her sibling. And there was a few examples where like Lena said that she would bribe her sibling with candy so that they could kiss. And Lena talked about how she masturbated with her sibling in bed next to her. And there was also this whole weird story about like looking inside of her siblings' private parts and things like that.
What?
So yeah, there's just like a few stories that everybody just felt really uncomfortable with. A lot of people have said that, well, she was a child when these things happened, and that's something that children explore when they're younger. That's not necessarily considered sexual, but overall, people just kind of were left with a bad taste in their mouth about these stories that she decided to share.
And I think it was starting to just get to a point with Lena Dunham, and we see this roller coaster, I suppose, with celebrity and fame generally. Like people are like, oh, this person's amazing, and they're super on board, and then it's like there's too much of them for a while, and then people get sick of it and they're like, we're actually kind of annoyed of this person. Lena Dunham is the like queen of oversharing and like TMI. Like her whole show, I mean, the Girls is like an overshare and TMI every episode, and that's why you're so uncomfortable watching it. So I'm not, I feel like some things you're just like, do you need to dive into explicit detail on some of these things, Lena? Like probably not. Like,
so that's already happening at this point. She has like a reputation for exactly being that, like just a little too much, where we're all like kind of just like, okay, Lena, we get it. And then she also, there was other controversies that we can touch on very lately, but she also during her podcast claimed that she wished that she had had an abortion, which people were not stoked to hear her say, because people are saying that an abortion is not something that you get to have. It's not this like thing that you get to go through. It's actually a really awful experience that no one should wish upon themselves. So that was another thing where everyone was like, okay, that's so tone deaf.
She really is Hannah, like from Girls. Because like, didn't Hannah say when she was getting an STD or an STI test, she was saying, oh, I hope I do have HIV, or I hope, and then the doctor just stops and she's like, okay, listen, no, you don't.
Yeah.
You idiot. Right? Like that's what this reminds me of, actually.
Totally. Yeah. And that's why it's like, it's so intertwined. And then there was another controversy that came out just a few months later. This whole podcast could just be the list of controversies from Lena Dunham, but she went to the Met Gala and she was seated at a table with a football player named Odell Beckham Jr. And she made a comment about how he took like one look at her and just like probably decided in his head that because of her body and how she looked, he just wasn't interested there, or that he didn't want to sleep with her. So people were like, okay, why are you coming up with this thing in your head? And
because she's so like, I'm sorry, but like Lena Dunham is just so self-obsessed. She is like, I mean, that just radiates from her, in my opinion. So it's just like, get over yourself a little bit and stop like just
it's like victim blaming herself,
articulating every thought that comes in your head like constantly. That's all, like, that's really what this comes down to.
And a huge thing is because of Twitter, and she's huge on Twitter, is that she would literally just tweet out every thought that came out and people are like, okay, you need to stop. Like, it's just getting ridiculous. So she was saying too, she was like, yeah, he took a look at me and then decided to like scroll on Instagram rather than like have a conversation with me. But it's like, why are you assuming that he's even thinking about sleeping with you or not sleeping with you? It's like, why are you putting these thoughts in his head that aren't even true? Nothing has even indicated to you that this could be the case. So then she ended up having to issue an apology to him.
She's just always issuing apologies.
Literally, I saw like several different Instagram posts where she has her photo that she posted it and then a big caption apology. And I'm like, she has had to issue just too many apologies.
It's a good thing she's a writer because she just has like the apology letter. She's like, all right, we're doing this.
She's like, okay, here's my format. Let's get into it. So
let's get the apology template out.
Just brutal. The one
she should just like, I'm sure she has a to whom it may concern Google Doc that's just ready to go.
Her career really in the last few years has really taken a turn, and she was in a very public relationship with Jack Antonoff, who's a musician.
I always found that pairing a little odd.
In the beginning, it seemed like it fit so well. She was a creator on Girls. He was this musician, writer, artist. Love
they're
the
both
dynamic.
like
They're both like hipster,
maybe, for sure.
Yeah, but then I think over time they spread apart, and she writes essays about the relationship too, and that seems to just be the case, that they just like kind of went their separate ways. I think also probably these controversies had a play in it because they are such public figures. Jack has reached huge heaps of success. He works a lot with Taylor Swift and Lorde and all of these artists. So I think they just kind of went their separate ways, but they were together for, I think, like over
I thought I heard
years.
that he cheated with Lorde, or was that just a internet rumor?
That was definitely an internet rumor, but it's because Lorde and him were working so closely together. They also went to the Grammys together and like have performed on stage together. And yeah, so that was the rumor that was going around. And he actually addressed it. He said that he like never addresses any sort of rumors and stuff like that. But he said that the rumor of him and Lorde, he referred to it as heteronormative bullshit. So he's saying that that's not the case. But I just think it's so interesting now because obviously we saw Lena get really close with Taylor Swift, obviously because Jack is such a musical partner with Taylor Swift. So it made a lot of sense that they would hang out all the time with Taylor Swift going over to his house and all this stuff. But Lena and Taylor Swift have maintained a quite strong friendship and are still very close friends, which I find very interesting, especially with the controversies around Lena Dunham. And Taylor was actually just a few months ago one of the bridesmaids in Lena Dunham's wedding when she just got married.
Really? So they're still quite close.
They're close. Yeah. So I just think that's interesting. And I wonder if like Taylor's worried about Lena's reputation with her because Taylor is such a strong advocate for a lot of the things that Lena has gotten in trouble for. So yeah, I don't know. I just feel like people aren't talking about that enough.
Let's go back to our question that we started off the episode with.
Was Girls really the voice of a generation now that it's in 10 years since the show came out?
Was it the voice of Lena Dunham's generation?
Yeah.
No. I mean, as a whole, no. Was it the voice of a generation? I actually do believe it was.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I think that because of the characters that we see on the show are, of course, you know, exaggerated to some extent, ridiculous and super just like there's a silliness to like all of the characters there. So it's not realistic per se, but I think that we all can relate to some of these characters. Like we can relate to some of these characters in some way. These like whiny entitled millennials. And I think that it is the voice of that type of generation. And, you know, even some of the other characters that you see, like Thomas John, played by Chris O'Dowd, who plays like this perfect loser who comes into a lot of money and then feels like he's not really a loser anymore because of that, like the finance bro type dude. We all have like met a version of these characters, right? Yeah. And so in that sense, I do find that it is a representation of our generation to some extent, but it is certainly not the voice of an entire generation, especially because there's just like literally no diversity in this portrayal whatsoever. So there is so there's that piece.
Yeah,
What are your
so
thoughts?
I think that sums it up really well. I think with what you said, it's maybe a voice for a niche, small, short generation, if that makes sense. It's like to a particular group of people, yes. For us, for a short amount of time, maybe in 2010, 2011, it was. But then now looking back, it's in the grand scheme, I don't think that it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's done stuff for pop culture. And I think this show has been like a step in what other shows have then become, because it was fresh and it did bring a lot of new things similar to how shows behind it did. But I don't think that it's going to be this grand thing that's going to be remembered way down the line.
I actually do think that this show
will?
is still going to be memorable. And I think that there's been, including myself, I don't know that I appreciated certain approaches to how the show was done. Like there's some things that I maybe just didn't get as, again, super self-absorbed millennial when I was watching it, watching a show about super self-absorbed millennials. I was like, oh yeah, like they're just like me. I hate myself. But when I look back on it now, I think the way the show approached it, it was almost too subtle at the time, this satirical approach, that it was like, I think we all kind of thought it was maybe meant to be somewhat realistic or a lot more realistic. And that's not really what it is, right? I think it is meant to be this, we're making fun.
Yeah, it's like this exaggerated version.
But it wasn't done in a very obvious way. It was done in a very subtle way. So I think we're going to look back on that part as, I think we're going to look back on it a little more fondly in that sense and just appreciate that approach a little bit more. I really do think that it was very impactful during the time that it was created. So I think it will still be memorable down the line. It's always going to be compared to the shows that came before it. And some shows I think will take some influence from this in the future as well.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. Nice. Cool.
So are you are Marnie or Jessa or Shoshana?
I'm none. Thank you so much. Thankfully.
Thank God. Yeah, it's fine.
Seriously.
I think I'm a Ray.
Yeah, I think I'm a Ray too. He was always the voice of reason. I always liked Ray.
Somewhat. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, if I have any advice, you can rewatch Girls, but it's not a comfort show. I think that should be noted. It's not like, oh, I'm like depressed and I'm going to like rewatch this show for comfort purposes. It's not that. You will feel uncomfortable most of the time, but it is worth revisiting and looking at it maybe through a different lens than when we watched it when it first came out.
You can definitely experience it in a different way. Don't forget that you can actually watch full episodes of the podcast on my YouTube channel. If you look up Shannon Burns or Pop for Thought, you can also follow us on Instagram so that you can take advantage of our trivia that Paulina comes out with every week that I love so much, and so much more that we have to offer on our Instagram at Pop for Thought Pod or TikTok, Pop for Thought. Yeah, all the things. You'll find us. Just Google it.
Just Google it. We're on TikTok? No, I'm just kidding.
We're on TikTok. Cool. Awesome. And we will talk to you
next week
with a very exciting episode I cannot wait for.
They're always exciting.
This one is extra exciting. So
I don't know what it is. What is it? Oh, yes, I do. Okay, no, we're not going to say.
Okay. I'll bleep that part.
It's a secret, but Shannon is going to, she is like off the walls.
It's my number one. So that's a hint. Okay.
That's a hint.
Okay. Talk to you next week.